A and locked country compresses years of change into a matter of weeks, unsettling assumptions that once seemed unshakable across the region. What appears administrative on the surface triggers reactions that ripple outward, exposing how fragile established balances become when pressure arrives unexpectedly. Why does this moment matter to you now, as Ibrahim Traoré stands at the center of decisions that quietly redraw lines of influence and expectation? Because what follows is not a local episode, but the opening movement of a shift with consequences far beyond its borders. What follows is not a dramatic retelling designed to impress, but a careful examination of forces that are usually reduced to slogans, headlines, or simplified narratives. You are about to hear a reading that clarifies what is actually changing, who is being repositioned, and why the timing of these developments matters far more than many observers currently assume. You will gain a clearer map of the dynamics at work and a sharper sense of where momentum is building. This is not material meant for casual listening. If this sequence is skipped, the risk is not simple ignorance, but misunderstanding. Events may appear disconnected, reactions may seem excessive, and decisions may look irrational when they are not. It becomes easy to mistake structural shifts for temporary noise, or to confuse momentum with intent. In fast-moving geopolitical environments, these errors accumulate quickly. They shape opinions, influence debates, and frame how future developments are interpreted. But it preserves blind spots at the very moment when clarity matters most. Two facts change the reading of this situation almost immediately, and neither is as visible as headlines suggest. The shift did not emerge from public confrontation or dramatic announcements, but from a sequence of administrative and diplomatic moves that accumulated quietly before their weight became undeniable. Second, the speed of alignment around those moves was faster than most external observers anticipated, compressing what would normally unfold over years into a far shorter window. One indicator captures that acceleration clearly within a single political cycle. Multiple bilateral and regional engagements were recalibrated to emphasize internal, African coordination rather than external dependence. This is not a symbolic adjustment. It signals a measurable change in how priorities are sequenced and how leverage is being tested. The context matters. For decades, many West African states operated within structures where economic strategy, mobility, and resource governance were externally constrained, even when sovereignty was formally intact. The initial trigger in this case was not ideological rhetoric, but practical cooperation framed as trust-building, visa facilitation, shared sectoral coordination, and accelerated bilateral mechanisms moved from discussion to execution with unusual speed. That velocity altered expectations. Why did the situation escalate in significance so quickly? Because once cooperation shifted from statements to implementation, it exposed a latent contradiction. Regional solidarity had long been declared, yet rarely operationalized at scale. Even partially, it disrupted established assumptions about who sets the tempo and who adapts. The first groups to feel the impact were not abstract institutions, but decision-makers working inside ministries, regulatory bodies, and economic planning units. Their calculations had to change, timelines shortened, margins for delay narrowed. External partners began reassessing signals they had previously considered stable. At this point, Ibrahim Traoré enters the frame, not as a rhetorical figure, but as a node within this realignment. His role matters less for what is said publicly than for how actions align across borders during a compressed period. The seriousness of the situation lies here once coordination crosses a threshold. Reversibility becomes costly. What initially appears as technical cooperation starts to function as a strategic test. This is why the moment cannot be dismissed as routine diplomacy. It marks a transition from declared intent to applied structure, and from slow evolution to deliberate compression. The implications of that shift are only beginning to surface. A clearer guide emerges once early effects are traced to the actors closest to the process rather than to public statements. Credibility did not come from speeches, but from how experienced officials, planners, and observers began adjusting their behavior in response to what they were seeing unfold. Their reactions signaled that the situation had crossed from speculative to operational. One senior regional observer described the change in tone as subtle but unmistakable. Meetings that once revolved around long-term intentions shifted toward near-term coordination, deadlines, and sequencing. The focus moved from what could be discussed to what had to be executed, and that shift alone altered the balance of attention. A first concrete impact appeared in economic coordination. Planning units that previously treated cross-border initiatives as secondary began integrating them into core functions. This was not framed as enthusiasm, but as risk management. Ignoring the shift now carried its own cost. That adjustment confirmed the change was not isolated to one capital or one sector. A second confirmation came from diplomatic routines. Engagements that once followed predictable ceremonial patterns became more technical and compressed. Fewer symbolic gestures, more working sessions, fewer declarations, more alignment checks. The pattern repeated often enough to suggest a trend rather than coincidence. At this stage, Ibrahim Traoré functions less as a focal personality and more as a reference point around which expectations are recalibrated. His presence in the narrative matters because actions associated with his leadership coincide with these early adaptations. Observers are not reacting to words, but to the consistency between intent and follow-through. From that moment onward, the situation stopped being interpreted as a series of isolated moves. It began to register as a coordinated trajectory, one that required attention precisely because it was unfolding quietly. The sequence begins without spectacle. Framed as cooperation rather than confrontation. Timelines appear generous. Expectations remain modest. And what was assumed to be exploratory becomes executable. Within days, follow-up mechanisms are activated. Conversations that once lingered move straight to calendars and responsibilities. The shift is quiet, but it is decisive. Momentum builds. Coordination expands laterally, not vertically. Instead of waiting for broad consensus, smaller alignments lock in first. Administrative pathways open where procedural resistance used to slow progress. Each step looks technical in isolation, yet together they create acceleration. Even if the direction is still debated. Pressure intensifies as reactions stack. External partners request clarification. Internal teams compress review cycles. What once unfolded sequentially now runs in parallel. Decisions overlap. The system begins to move faster than the habits designed to manage it. At the center of this phase, Ibrahim Traoré becomes associated with the pivot from intention to action. But because decisions attributed to his leadership consistently arrive earlier than expected. Signals resolve. Resolve triggers recalculation. The escalation phase follows quickly. A move in one domain prompts adjustment in another. Economic coordination intersects with mobility. Mobility touches labor. Labor affects planning. Each linkage tightens the overall structure. No single moment feels explosive, yet the accumulation generates strain. Established assumptions start slipping. Reactions diversify. Some actors accelerate to keep pace. Others hesitate, hoping the tempo will normalize. That hesitation proves costly. As alignment continues, opting out becomes more visible. Neutrality starts to look like delay. Delay starts to look like opposition. The narrative shifts subtly but firmly. Communication patterns change. Public language grows more cautious. Scenarios are sketched with shorter horizons. Risk assessments are updated mid-cycle. The environment no longer rewards waiting for clarity. Then the aftershocks settle in, not as collapse, but as reconfiguration. Processes that cannot keep up are sidelined. Informal channels gain weight. New reference points emerge. The cost of reversal rises not because it is impossible, but because unwinding now requires explanation, justification, and time. For those closest to the process, the realization arrives gradually. This was not a burst of activity meant to signal intent. It was a deliberate compression designed to test limits. Those limits did not snap, but they bent, and in bending, they reshaped the path forward. By this stage, the situation no longer reads as a chain of reactions. It reads as a trajectory. What began as coordination now functions as momentum. The story has moved beyond the question of whether change is happening. The more pressing question is how far the sequence will run before equilibrium is redefined again. Up to this point, the pattern has been readable through behavior, timing, and alignment. What follows tightens that reading by grounding it in measurable signals. This is where perception gives way to scale, and where intuition is tested against weight. The first figure anchors the size of the shift. Within a single operational window, coordination mechanisms that previously took multiple cycles to activate were compressed into one. In practical terms, processes that once unfolded sequentially were executed in parallel. That compression matters because it changes capacity. It shows that the system is no longer optimized for deliberation, but for throughput. Influence travels faster than resistance. The meaning of this number is straightforward. It indicates that the change is not symbolic. It reflects a structural adjustment in how decisions move from agreement to execution, reducing friction that had long been treated as inevitable. The second figure anchors speed. The interval between announcement and implementation narrowed sharply compared to earlier benchmarks. What used to require extended validation now cleared in a fraction of the time. This is not acceleration for its own sake. It reflects a recalibration of acceptable delay. This figure signals urgency. When time horizons shrink, actors are forced to reveal priorities. Optional steps drop away. Only processes considered essential survive compression, which makes the resulting structure more legible and more decisive. The third figure anchors human impact. Changes in coordination and timing translated directly into shifts experienced by people working inside the system. Review cycles shortened. The margin for error narrowed. These effects are not abstract. They shape daily behavior, stress levels, and risk tolerance. What this number captures is pressure. It shows how structural acceleration redistributes burden downward, not just outward. Systems can absorb speed only if individuals adapt, and that adaptation carries cost. Taken together, these figures establish three things at once. The change is large enough to matter, fast enough to disrupt habits, and close enough to daily operations to be felt immediately. This combination is rare. Size without speed can be managed. Speed without size can be ignored. Proximity without scale fades. All three converge. This convergence explains why reactions intensified even without overt confrontation. Date a forced recalculation where rhetoric would not. Old reference points lost relevance. Comparisons drawn from previous cycles no longer applied. In this context, Ibrahim Traoré is less important as a symbol than as a timing marker. Actions associated with his leadership coincide with the moment when baseline assumptions no longer held. The numbers do not describe personality. The weight of this section lies in its implication. When scale, speed, and human impact align, reversibility becomes difficult. Adjustments can still occur, but they require redesign rather than rollback. This is the point at which observers stop asking whether the shift is real and start asking how it will be managed. The evidence does not argue for inevitability. It argues for consequence. What is unfolding carries momentum because it is measurable, operational, and already embedded in practice. That is why the discussion now moves beyond interpretation and into choice. It would be incomplete to move forward without acknowledging that credible objections exist, and that some of them are raised in good faith. A number of analysts argue that what appears to be acceleration is simply administrative efficiency catching up after long delays, not evidence of deeper realignment. From this view, compressed timelines reflect backlog clearance rather than strategic intent, and reading too much into speed risks overstating coherence where there may only be momentum. This argument has strength. African institutions have often been constrained by procedure, capacity gaps, and external bottlenecks. When those constraints cease even temporarily, activity naturally spikes. Seen through this lens, recent coordination could normalize once the backlog clears, returning processes to familiar rhythms without lasting structural change. However, this explanation omits a critical element. Backlog clearance tends to produce bursts that are uneven and isolated. What is observed here is different. Acceleration appears across multiple domains at once, with sequencing that reinforces rather than fragments outcomes. Efficiency alone becomes an insufficient explanation. A second objection centers on durability. Critics suggest that alignment driven by individual leadership styles may fade once attention shifts or political conditions change. Associating momentum with figures like Ibrahim Traoré risks personalizing what should be understood as contingent and reversible. Leadership-driven speed, they argue, is vulnerable to fatigue, resistance, or external pressure. This concern is not unfounded. History offers many examples where rapid early movements told once initial energy dissipated. Yet durability does not depend solely on personalities. It depends on whether processes outlive the moment that created them. In this case, mechanisms have already altered how decisions are rooted, reviewed, and executed. That matters because structures, once adjusted, tend to persist unless actively dismantled. A third critique warns of overinterpretation from limited data. Numbers can indicate direction, but they can also exaggerate significance if context is ignored. Small samples, short windows, and exceptional circumstances can distort conclusions. Here again, caution is warranted, but context cuts both ways. When multiple indicators align despite different sources and incentives, the risk shifts from overreading to underestimating. The question is not whether every signal proves transformation, but whether enough of them converge to demand attention. When these perspectives are placed side by side, a clearer picture emerges. Skepticism highlights uncertainty, but it does not erase pattern. Leadership matters, but structure carries weight. The situation resists simple dismissal precisely because it survives reasonable doubt. This is where the analysis stabilizes. The issue is not choosing sides between optimism and caution. It is recognizing that the conditions now visible warrant in serious consideration, not because they guarantee an outcome, but because they narrow the range of plausible futures. And then the trajectory shifts. What had been read primarily as acceleration suddenly reveals a deeper layer that reframes everything before it. The change is not only about how fast decisions move, but about where control over those decisions is beginning to settle. This is the point where speed stops being the headline and structure becomes the story. The midpoint reveal lies in a subtle but decisive adjustment. Coordination, that initially looked temporary, starts embedding itself into routines that normally resist alteration. What was assumed to be situational becomes procedural. That transition matters because procedures outlast moments. At this stage, observers notice that rollback would no longer be neutral. Reversing course would now require justification, not just silence. It would demand explanation to partners, to internal teams, and to constituencies already adapting their expectations. The cost of slowing down rises precisely because the system has begun to normalize the new pace. This is where the role of Ibrahim Traoré takes on a different meaning. His name functioned as a reference point for momentum. Here, it becomes associated with a threshold being crossed. Actions linked to his leadership align with the moment when coordination ceases to be optional and starts behaving like default. The impact of this reveal is not dramatic on the surface. There is no single announcement, no visible rupture. The environment quietly changes its rules. Actors begin planning under the assumption that the new structure will hold, at least long enough to matter. From here on, the story no longer turns on whether change is happening. It turns on how different groups respond to a reality that is already in motion. The more consequential dynamics are only starting to surface, and they will be felt most clearly where abstraction gives way to daily consequence. The consequences become visible once attention moves away from coordination rooms and into the environments where decisions translate into pressure. Structure and alignment begins to materialize as concrete effects. This is the point where abstraction ends and lived reality begins. At the level of the state, the first impact is decisional compression. Authorities faced either windows to respond, approve, or adapt. Policy sequencing becomes harder to stagger, and hesitation carries higher political and administrative cost. When coordination accelerates externally, internal coherence is tested. Credibility is no longer judged by intent, but by responsiveness. In this environment, governments are pulled into a reactive posture even when they prefer gradualism. And stability becomes something that must be actively managed rather than assumed. For businesses, the effect is felt through uncertainty in rhythm rather than direction. Supply arrangements and cross-border planning rely heavily on predictable timelines. As those timelines shorten, risk assessments have to be rewritten. Some firms move quickly to align, seeing opportunity in early positioning. Others slow down, waiting for clarity that no longer arrives on a comfortable schedule. The result is uneven adaptation, where speed itself becomes a competitive factor rather than a secondary concern. Among people on the ground, the impact is quieter but more immediate. Faster decision cycles mean faster changes in rules, access, and expectations. Local administrators and service providers are asked to adjust with less notice and less margin for error. Stress increases not because outcomes are uniformly negative, but because variability rises. When systems move quickly, individuals absorb volatility first. At the regional level, the ripple effect widens. Neighboring states are forced to reassess assumptions they previously treated as stable. Coordination in one corridor alters incentives in another. Neutrality becomes harder to sustain because opting out increasingly looks like falling behind. Alignment spreads not through coercion, but through comparison. No actor wants to be the slow reference point when momentum is rewarded. Internationally, the signal is more subtle but no less significant. External partners recalibrate expectations, not necessarily changing policy overnight, but adjusting tone, risk tolerance, and engagement posture. What once appeared incremental now reads as directional, regardless of intent. Across all these layers, Ibrahim Traoré appears not as the sole cause, but as a consistent marker within the sequence. His relevance lies in the overlap between leadership decisions and the moment when consequences begin to cascade outward. By the time effects are visible at this scale, agency has already narrowed. The defining feature of this phase is that no group remains untouched. The pace may feel manageable in isolation, but collectively it reshapes how time, risk, and responsibility are distributed. Once consequences propagate this broadly, the question is no longer who initiated the shift. It is who can adapt without losing coherence. The most useful way to think forward is not prediction, but range. When momentum has already altered structures, the future tends to cluster around a few plausible paths rather than scatter randomly. 3 scenarios capture that range with reasonable discipline. In the base scenario, the trajectory continues without dramatic rupture. Coordination remains active but uneven, advancing where incentives align and slowing where resistance is costly. Institutions adapt incrementally, learning to operate within shorter cycles without fully redesigning themselves. The environment stays tense but functional. Friction does not disappear, yet it becomes manageable through adjustment rather than confrontation. And stability is preserved through constant recalibration rather than resolution. In a more optimistic scenario, early adaptation compounds. Actors who adjust quickly begin setting informal standards that others follow. Trust accumulates through repetition rather than declaration. As routines settle, uncertainty declines and investment horizons lengthen again, albeit under new assumptions. Coordination deepens not because pressure increases, but because predictability returns at a higher tempo. In this path, the initial strain pays off by producing a system that is both faster and more coherent, allowing gains to spread beyond early adopters. The worst-case scenario emerges if compression outpaces capacity. When speed continues to rise without parallel investment in coordination quality, errors accumulate. Fatigue sets in, missed signals and misaligned expectations trigger backlash, not necessarily open conflict, but quiet disengagement. In this environment, reversals become more tempting because strain outweighs perceived benefit. Momentum stalls, not with a crash, but with fragmentation. The cost here is not collapse, but lost credibility and wasted effort, leaving all actors worse positioned than before acceleration began. What matters is that none of these outcomes is predetermined. Each depends less on intent than on execution under pressure. Systems do not fail because they move quickly, but because they move quickly without learning. The practical lesson is not to choose which scenario will occur, but to prepare for all 3. And honesty about limits matter more than confidence in direction. The future will reward those who treat speed as a condition to manage, not a virtue to celebrate or a threat to fear. Awareness becomes the primary advantage. After tracing the broader dynamics and the possible paths ahead, the question naturally shifts closer. What does all of this mean for the person listening right now? Not as an analyst or policymaker, but as someone living within an environment shaped by these shifts. For those who actively follow regional and global developments, this moment offers an advantage, but also a responsibility. Early awareness creates room to think ahead, yet it requires discipline to separate signal from noise. The pace of change makes it tempting to overreact to every update. The more useful response is steady attention, tracking patterns rather than headlines, and recognizing when acceleration is structural rather than episodic. For those affected indirectly, through work, markets, or community life, the impact is subtler but still real. Shorter decision cycles upstream often translate into quicker changes downstream. Expectations shift faster. Plans need more flexibility. The adjustment here is less about prediction and more about readiness. Accepting that stability may come from adaptability rather than from fixed assumptions. There is also a third group, those who feel distant from these developments and assume they will remain so. Structural shifts rarely announce when they begin to matter personally. By the time effects are obvious, options are narrower, but of self-protection against surprise. Across these groups, the common thread is agency. Understanding what is unfolding does not mean controlling it, but it does reduce helplessness. Awareness expands the range of possible responses even when outcomes remain uncertain. Ibrahim Traoré appears again in this context not as a figure to admire or reject, but as part of the environment shaping these conditions. His relevance lies in timing, not symbolism. Wherever one stands, following this story is less about choosing a side and more about staying oriented. Orientation in periods of compression is what prevents people from being carried along without realizing how far they have moved. Any discussion of next steps has to begin with a constraint. Solutions cannot remain rhetorical, because the environment described so far already operates on execution, not intention. What matters now is clarity about who acts, how quickly, and how progress is recognized. At the central level, leadership and state institutions carry the first responsibility. The immediate task is not expansion, but consolidation. Processes that have accelerated need stabilization without reverting to delay. That means setting clear sequencing rules, defining which decisions must remain fast and which require deliberate pause, and aligning internal review capacity with the new tempo. But by reduced friction and fewer mid-course corrections over a defined period. The second layer involves organizations and economic actors operating within this compressed cycle. Their role is adaptation rather than initiation. Practical steps include adjusting planning horizons, diversifying assumptions, and strengthening coordination units that translate policy shifts into operational terms. Effectiveness is visible when uncertainty stops producing paralysis and begins producing structured response. At the community and individual level, the solution is modest but essential. The task is not to carry strategic weight, but to adjust expectations and behavior, allowing flexibility in planning and recognizing that rapid change is now a condition rather than an exception are all measurable shifts. Here, success shows up as resilience rather than control. A further step, where feasible, lies in regional coordination. Transparent timelines and communication protocols reduce misunderstanding when multiple systems accelerate together. Within this framework, Ibrahim Traoré is relevant insofar as leadership choices influence whether acceleration is disciplined or chaotic. The measure is not ambition, but follow-through that remains legible to those affected. The core principle is simple. Solutions only matter if they absorb speed rather than amplify strain. When action is matched with capacity, momentum becomes manageable. Even well-intended change erodes trust. The difference lies in execution, not rhetoric. The image from earlier returns quietly, not as a symbol but as a reference point. The moment when coordination shifted from discussion to routine now feels distant, even though little time has passed. Looking back across the sequence, it becomes clear how much ground has been covered in a compressed span and how expectations adjusted along the way. What began as cautious alignment moved through acceleration, resistance, and recalibration until it settled into something heavier than intent. The path traced was not dramatic every step. Yet its cumulative effect reshaped how actors think about time, responsibility, and leverage. The listener has traveled that path too, from first disruption to consequence. In that journey, Ibrahim Traoré stands less as a destination than as a marker within motion. His presence signals a period when decisions stopped waiting for comfort and began testing limits. The significance lies not in personality, but in what that timing revealed about readiness and resolve. The deeper meaning sits beneath the events themselves. This story is not only about coordination or leadership, but about choice under compression. Systems, institutions, and people are defined not when time is abundant, but when it contracts. What matters then is not certainty, but clarity of response. This is why the sequence lingers. It is not a closed chapter, but a reminder that momentum carries values with it. Speed can clarify priorities, but it can also expose fragility. The difference is shaped by awareness. And at this point, one truth remains difficult to ignore. What endures is not what was said, but how decisively reality was met. As this sequence comes to rest, it does not demand agreement or allegiance. It asks for reflection. Each person will read these developments through their own experience, their own concerns, and their own expectations of the future. That diversity of interpretation is not a weakness. It is how understanding deepens. If this story feels worth holding on to, it is likely because it touches something broader than a single country or moment. It speaks to how change arrives quietly, gathers speed, and then asks for response rather than commentary. Sharing such a perspective is not about amplification, but about orientation, helping others see the contours before they are fully drawn. There is also space here for dialogue, not slogans. Not certainty, but thoughtful exchange. What signals feel most important now? Where momentum should be guided rather than resisted? These are questions without simple answers, and they benefit from collective thinking. Ibrahim Traoré remains part of this conversation only insofar as timing matters. Leadership choices intersect with structural shifts, but they do not replace the responsibility of those observing and adapting. The door that opens at the end of this story is not one of conclusion, but of continuity. Awareness shared becomes awareness multiplied. And in periods of compression, that shared orientation is often what prevents silence from becoming distance.